Welcome to the second of our 3 reflections. I'm Jenny Sinclair from Together for the Common Good. In each of these reflections, we're exploring what it means to be a justice-seeking church. In the first, we spent time with Exodus and Deuteronomy, looking at our context, what's going on in society and the economy, how our modern Egypt drives inequality and relationship breakdown. In this second reflection, we're going to look at the dynamic between the church and poor communities. And then in the third reflection, we'll explore in practical terms what a relational, justice-seeking church looks like. So let's think about the people in our country, and in particular about our neighbours who are struggling to make ends meet. Let's spend a moment of silence with this passage from 1 Corinthians. I'll give you a moment to read this. Notice if there's a word or a phrase that stands out for you. So, in these individualistic times, how do we find our way to live as one body? If we want to become a justice-seeking church, we need to start by having an honest conversation about our relationship with poor communities. One of the central Catholic social teaching principles is the preferential option for the poor. It's central not just because the poor need help. There's a deeper significance. It's central because if the strong are separated from the weak, the whole body gets out of balance. The strong need to be in relationship with the weak. This reciprocal relationship is the great mystery at the heart of God's special love for the poor. Remember, God's economy has a relational form of justice, where we are to accompany each other when one of us is struggling. St. Lawrence, who was a deacon in the early church of the 4th century, described the poor as the treasure of the church. In our time, Pope Francis says Christians must live in solidarity with poor communities. Indeed, he says the church needs to be evangelized by the poor. He says this because someone who is poor has a sense of their need for others and for God that the affluent and the busy so easily lose. What he means is that poor people are less likely to be captured by the culture of individualism, by the modern Egypt. They've not completely lost that kingdom instinct of needing others. This is fundamental because that kingdom instinct is the essence of what it means to be human. We can sense this from Jesus when he says, "Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God." The experience of poor people shows us what's really going on. Living on the hard edges of life reveals a wound invisible to the rest of society. We can't really appreciate this just from reading about it. It's only when we share life with poor communities that we see the way God sees. So we need to share everyday life with our neighbours who are poor. It could be us one day, members of one body. Our shared life is also how we describe the common good. The common good is relational, practical, and requires our involvement. We need to build a common good between groups whose interests are perceived to be estranged. Let's say between tenants and landlords, business and unions, men and women, young and old, urban and rural. And at a more macro level, we desperately need a common good to be negotiated between labour and capital. We're looking for balance. But we can start in our own relationships by building a common good with someone who is struggling and accompanying them until they're back on their feet. I know a woman who's been in terrible debt for 2 years. She told me she was in church every week and didn't tell a soul. And nobody asked. Sadly, I think we all know that's not an isolated story. That story exposes not only that she was left alone, but that the church was poorer for its ignorance of her situation. A shared life would have provided a more accurate understanding of what's going on and an opportunity for connection. We desperately need the church to build a common good with poor communities. but currently, it's not clear whose side the church is on. What might we learn from Jesus in his time? It's clear whose side he was on. In the Roman political economy of Galilee, Jesus was a manual worker, part of the peasantry. The Roman economy privileged the elites who controlled the storehouses and kept down the wages of the poor. Jesus resisted the excesses of this economy and the damage it did by promoting the kingdom. His instinct was to bring people together in solidarity across class, across ethnicity, across educational background, to build a relational power. Jesus' resistance was non-violent and sacrificial, based on love and just relationships. In our own time, how will the churches respond? Will they act in solidarity with poor communities? There was a time when many churches, especially Catholic and Methodist, had a covenantal relationship with people and place and were closely involved with poor families. The Wesleyan concept of social holiness and the opportunities for self-betterment through classes and bands and other forms of organising and local association enabled people from poor families to grow in confidence. Many became preachers and lay leaders, and this was a key factor in the development of the trades union and mutual aid society movements. But today is a different story. Many churches of all denominations have become captured by a middle-class culture and fallen out of relationship with poor communities. Many Christians tell me privately they're more comfortable helping refugees or fundraising for charity at arm's length than they are in helping poor families in their own neighbourhood. There is fear and a lack of confidence. Issues of decline have led some to withdraw completely. As a recent report from Church Action on Poverty shows, more churches closed in low-income areas than in affluent areas, signalling that the church doesn't care. I can't help thinking that in this season of decline in the West, God could be humbling the church so that in its poverty it realises its need for others, especially the poor. The coming months and years are likely to be hard. We'll need to build up a greater mutual dependence at local level. This could become an inflection point for those churches willing to become more relational. Some churches already do this brilliantly, and others are beginning, but too many are unable to make this change. But how did this estrangement happen? The language often used about poor people in church social action circles gives us a clue. Terms like outreach and service delivery is not the language of friendship and mutual respect. Likewise, professional class terminology like community development, projects, and facilitators betrays a managerial mindset, well-intentioned but unintentionally alienating the people it aims to help. While using the language of empowerment, these interventions often leave poor communities disempowered because what is really needed is the dignity of work. The term marginalised may sound appropriate from a church activist position, but it depends where you stand. From God's worldview, poor people are not marginal. The number of people classified as poor in the UK is currently around 14 million. That's a lot of people. It doesn't feel marginal to me. Ironically, it's actually the church that is marginalised. It needs friends. This managerial language world in the church, with its associated strategies and funding applications, is part of the culture of contract, the modern Egypt. Quite different from the covenantal language of dwelling in the local with God and neighbour. The church has a sacred vocation to be transformational, not to be useful. Many churches are proud to provide food banks, but the truth is they just mitigate injustice. This is the well-known food bank paradox. They meet increasing need and are essential, but mask the prophetic. Food banks have become a fixture of a toxic, low-wage economy propping up big corporations. They're in a trap. The more efficient emergency food aid becomes, the less urgent economic reform appears to be. The Church talks a lot about advocacy for the poor, as if the poor need the Church to be angry because they can't do it for themselves. But this can alienate the very people it aims to help. It depends what you're advocating for, jobs or benefits. As we saw in the first reflection, after poor communities were abandoned, they gave up on the Church when it failed to defend their interests, as it had done in the past. There's been mission drift in terms of the model of justice the Church has followed. It got stuck on welfarism and failed to advocate for economic reform. From a Catholic social teaching perspective, the dignity of work is central, and so parking generations of people on benefits is an outrage. A friend of mine from a poor community says, handouts are soul-destroying. People need dignified work so they can maintain some self-respect. My late father, David Shepherd, in his book Bias to the Poor, published 40 years ago this year, influential on the Church at that time, made the mistaken assumption that financial redistribution through the benefit system was the solution to poverty. Well, it didn't work. Things have got much worse. Campaigning for benefits cannot, by definition, end poverty. It merely mitigates injustice. It does nothing to resist an economic system geared to the interests of capital. In fact, it feeds it. It feeds a defeatist politics of low expectations. When the Church colludes with money power and state power, abandoning places it has served for centuries, this is a breach of the common good. To be covenantal, the churches should demand investment and decent jobs to restore the abandoned places. Let's look at this passage about the Samaritan who helped the man in trouble. I can't help noticing that not only he didn't walk by on the other side, he didn't outsource the situation either. He didn't give the man money. He retains his humanity by giving his time, by tending the man's wounds personally, by staying overnight, and by planning to return. A relationship is being formed. Pope Francis tells that story to illustrate why we must take personal responsibility. He says solutions are not to be found in activism or welfarism. He says we should stop outsourcing, whether to the state or to charities. He's not saying they shouldn't exist. Of course he isn't. Catholic social teaching affirms charitable activity when it's relational and reciprocal, and the state has an important role. The point is that for human flourishing, people's primary relationships should be with each other rather than within personal institutions. This shows us that in many cases, having outsourced much of the relational communitarian work we used to be involved with, we, the Church, have lost touch with our ability to be relational. Too many churches fell into this transactional exchange, becoming the deliverer or the rescuer, where the poor person is the recipient. Instead, we're called to give a hand up, and to do so in a way that opens us up to being able to receive as well. Because when we receive, we give the other person dignity, and our hearts are open to mutual transformation. This is a posture of solidarity and a lesson in the Catholic principle of subsidiarity, where we take responsibility according to our calling and ability. We're not to use the welfare system or charitable agencies as a way of keeping poor people at arm's length. Francis says it's personal. So this is challenging for those engaged with the social action service provider posture. Pope Francis is highlighting the divisive benefactor-recipient dynamic and how it alienates the very people the Church wishes to help because it creates a tension of us and them. For the recipient, being on the receiving end can result in further disempowerment, and for the volunteer activist, it can be a recipe for burnout. Instead, we are to build long-term relationships and build a common good together. If we can make this shift, we'll be better able to join in God's mission. Jesus never abandons the poor, whom he honours the most. His love is not conditional, not contractual, but covenantal. This is the relational way of justice, a taste of the kingdom. Local relationships can begin to offer a resistance to the powers. Building on our first reflection, where we examined the causes of injustice, this time we've looked at the dynamics between the church and poor communities. In the next, third and final reflection, we'll see that to become a justice-seeking church, relationships must come first, and we'll explore what that looks like in practice. Let's end with a moment of silence as we contemplate this passage from the book of Revelation. Note what stands out for you, and together reflect on the question: whose side is the church on? And what do we need to repent?